Well, this morning, guys, we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Allow me this morning, if you will, our text is actually supposed to be verses 15 through 22, but as I studied this chapter this week, I really couldn't ignore some of the verses prior to verse 15. So I'm going to just kind of hop around a little bit, if you don't mind, this morning. There were some verses I just couldn't ignore, and I thought, as God spoke to me, I thought, I think I want to discuss these verses in our class this morning. So I'm going to just kind of bounce around a little bit. There's no real flow to where I'm at in this particular chapter, but when you're trying to do like we're doing, where you're attempting to go through the whole book in just 5 or 6 weeks, you end up having to kind of leapfrog, and sometimes I think we do an injustice to ourselves, missing some really, really good parts of chapters. And so I'm going to just start in verse 1 today, but I'm going to kind of eventually get up to around verse 18. Is about as far as we'll get. I know I talk about this a lot. You probably get tired of hearing me talk about it, but I always talk about the two trees, don't I? It's just a thing with me that I know that everything starts with life as we know it, with two trees in the Garden of Eden. And we are aware of the precedent that was set in the Garden of Eden, especially in regards to the two trees. You'll recall the wording that it says in Genesis that they were in the midst of the garden. So you get the impression that these trees were within proximity of each other, within maybe even viewing distance of each other. We don't know specifically, but in one place in chapter 2 it indicates that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is in the midst, and in chapter 3 it indicates, well, I think it's the other way around. In chapter 2 it mentions that the tree of life is in the midst of the garden, and then Eve tells Satan about the tree of knowledge of good and evil being in the midst of the garden. So we get the impression that both of them are in the midst, within some proximity to each other.
Well, I may be dumb, but you're the first person I've ever heard bring that up, because in my mind, because I hadn't studied it well, I always think, well, you can have anything. You can eat and have any of this, but don't this one. So I don't think of two trees. I think of you could have anything or this one tree. But it is a choice. It's still the same idea.
Yeah, and as I like to state, God is pro-choice, and He definitely put them there right in the middle. Even though He commanded them not to eat it, He still put it there for them to see, and it was a choice. They could still partake of it or not. And you'll recall that God allowed Satan to have access to them, just like we studied in Job in these recent weeks. And God allowed Satan to have exposure to Eve specifically. And we recall that Satan offered Eve a different perspective than what God had said. God had said, if you eat of it, you'll surely die. And the devil said, well, if you eat of it, you won't die. But, and then he goes on to say that not only will you not die, but you'll be as gods, knowing you'll have additional knowledge beyond what they knew. And by the way, he was telling the truth there. They would have knowledge that they didn't know, because their eyes were opened, just as Satan said it would be. And this is the beginning of there being a different way offered to humans than what God's way is. God's got a way, but the devil offers an alternative. And so we've seen this in our lifetime expedited to new heights in ways in which we never thought we would see. And so we fast forward to Ecclesiastes 7, where you see here we have a man who knew the right way. I mean, goodness, if anybody knew the right way, it was definitely Solomon. And in his younger years, which when you think about that, when I say it, in his younger years, he was more wise than in his latter years. I mean, isn't it typically the opposite? You look at, I'm looking at what my son is going through right now, and he's where a typical person would be, a typical kid his age would be, searching and not always applying wisdom. And here we have the exact opposite with Solomon. We have a young man who was wise. God gives him this great opportunity to have anything he wants, and he chooses wisdom. What young person chooses that? But in the latter stages of his life, we see that Solomon is anything really but using the wisdom that God gave him. We will see elements of it in chapter 7 today for sure. But he's definitely in more of a secular form of thinking here, even though he acknowledges God, and we'll see that in chapter 7. He acknowledges God, but he lets his God-given wisdom sometimes lead him astray. And Tom talked about this in the last 2 lessons. And by the way, I appreciate Tom speaking. Tom, you have a wonderful voice. I listened to you on audio as opposed to video this week. Man, I envy your. He has a radio voice. Not only that, but he has well, the difference. Tom has mastered the King's English too, though. He's just got it down. I'm envious of his ability to use the English language. I appreciate you filling in for me. I really do. I'm kind of jealous. Wish I had some of those skills, but nonetheless, I use the ones God gave me.
Speaking of Solomon, how he ended up falling, and obviously I don't think it's smart to have 700 wives and 300 concubines. I think a modern day example is James McDonald. As much as I love him,
Right.
I think preachers that get to that mega church status and they have so much power, they don't even realize they can get drunk on it. And obviously he made some bad decisions. Thank goodness they weren't, he was having women on the side, that kind of thing. His is more anger and arrogance. Mm-hmm. And he is making a comeback, by the way.
Yeah, I saw.
Which is good. He's repentant. I don't know that he'll ever get to where he was. But that's what I think about Solomon. He was young, he was on fire, like right out of seminary, these young preachers, and then after a while, you either get burned out or you get drunk on that type of power.
Mm-hmm. And I think Solomon definitely had an issue with that. And adding to that, he's attempting to find whatever it was that he was trying to regain from his younger years through alternative sources, mainly through sources that are more under the sun, as Tom referenced, and under the heaven on the last 2 weeks. And he's allowing himself to be this guinea pig in the journey, which is very interesting. The book of Ecclesiastes has 222 verses, and yet in 65 of those 222 verses, the personal pronoun I is used, which is basically 2 times for every 5 verses. It's interesting. Yeah, no comment. So in our text today, though, we're going to see a lot of the wisdom that God gave wisdom, and it's obvious that as we move through these chapters and we get closer to the end, which we have I think 2 more weeks left, that we see Solomon getting closer to understanding where he should be spiritually. And he's going to state a lot. Matter of fact, the lesson title is "Where's the Balance?" is what our lesson title is this morning, and he's trying to find that balance. But you may find in his counsel in chapter 7 some good advice and some questionable advice, and we'll look at a little bit of that. Look a little bit at that this morning. But before we do, start in verse 1. Let's open up in prayer and ask the Lord to bless our time in His Word and to speak to us, and maybe in a way in which you're not expecting, because that's how it happened for me this week when I started into this book. I ended up in one place and I found myself in another, and this morning as I was walking into pasture, it really hit me where God was speaking to me in this passage, and it caught me off guard. I thought it was going to be one way, and it ended up being another. So I'm hoping that this passage will speak to you too. I think it's speaking to our age group. It's what I sense. I think it's speaking to us this morning. I'm not saying it can't speak to others, but I think it's saying something. At least it did to me, and I just want to just kind of relate that to you. And I'm hoping you see what I saw this week as I studied. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, I thank you for your word and how relevant it is for life today, but just relevant for where I am today. It's meeting me where I am, where the rubber meets the road at my age, at 55, where I look at my life. I feel as though you spoke to me, and I pray that I can relate that this morning to those of us who are listening. Thank you for your word that's so fresh. Thank you for preserving it. No matter how the devil and the world has tried to attack it, it's still here. And God, we relish your word. Thank you for it. And God, I pray you give us an intense desire to study it and not just get it on Sunday morning, but to use it during the week. Add to that, Father, I pray that you increase our desire to speak to you in relationship, and that we want to converse with you all of the time, to always be online with you. So bless our time in your word this morning. I pray this in the most sincere way I know. Amen. Well, if you look at verse 1 here, Solomon starts off with saying, a good name is better than precious ointment. Let me just stop there, and I'll get to that other half of the verse later. Well, I tell you what, let me do something else. Let me just read the first four verses. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that it is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. If I didn't give you the address to this book, and you didn't know we were in Ecclesiastes 7, where would you think we're reading? Does it sound like another book to you? Sounds like Proverbs. Sounds very similar to Proverbs. Some of these very same things are mentioned in Proverbs. That was the first thing that struck me. As a matter of fact, I think some of the Bibles actually kind of call us the Proverbs of Ecclesiastes, this particular chapter.
Same author.
Yeah, same author. Yeah, obviously. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. But you would think, though, that you're reading Proverbs. I mean, and there are other books of the Bible that are the same men have written, but they don't have the same sound as this right here. So you notice a particular theme here, though, that he's using. He's using this comparative type theme where he compares one thing to another. A good name is better than precious ointment. The day of death is better than the day of one's birth. And he just constantly comparing here in this first part of chapter 7. And he's using one contrast to illustrate the other. And he starts off in verse 1 saying a good name is better than precious ointment. And you mentioned James MacDonald. The name MacDonald, 10 years ago, James MacDonald's name meant one thing. But now when you hear James MacDonald's name, it means another. Because his name has been affected by some actions that he has taken or not taken. And so he compares the good name to precious ointment. And we spent in these several months ago, we talked about precious ointment where Jesus has precious ointment put on his feet. And we spent some time in talking about this ointment and how costly it would be and how that, there were different like perfumes, or there were different type of, you could almost say like, potions, I guess, something like that. Something that you would have that would be very valuable, that was kept in a very special place in the house. It was worth a lot. It was a place where the kids were not to mess with that bottle. That was Mama and Daddy's precious ointment. And so he is saying here that the very costly ointment, that a better name is more precious than that ointment. And so we know that is true, that when my name is said, and I used to tell my kids, remember who you are, remember who you represent. If you go out and you do something, you can taint our name. And now when someone hears our last name, it could represent something, really bad. But of course, that doesn't say that a bad name can't be fixed. You may have known of some bad names that had bad things associated with it, but over time, it's not as bad as it was. I'm sure back in the late 1800s, to have the last name Booth was probably not a good name to have. But now we don't really think about that as much. I know some Booths, and I don't think of John Wilkes Booth when I think of them. And so names.
Bells do you know?
So first names can apply too, and then that's thousands of years ago. And that name has still never been able to fix itself. There's not many Jezebels.
That name was gone with the dogs eating it.
So, but the reputation can, unlike the ointment, can last a long time. The ointment, once it's used, the ointment's gone. But the reputation of a last name can last generations. And then he goes on to say that one's death is better. The day of one's death is better than one's birth. Boy, and of course we have to remember where Solomon is in his life right now. He is a pessimist. He's not in the most positive part of his life. And this statement, I think, is emblematic of where he is in his searching. And he kind of has a negative attitude in some ways in this book. But what struck me about this is that while that's a very negative statement that he would make, it almost reminds me of the comment that Job made, where he cursed the day he was born. In some ways, for the Christian, this is true. That the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. Because as Christians, we are looking forward to, in a way, not really, but we may not be looking forward to our death, but we're not fearful of our death, because we know that when we die, we will see Christ. And Paul talked about this in Philippians 1:22 through verses 24. Let me read these 3 verses. He said, this is Paul, "If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ. That is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account." So he's saying that really, and of course, using Paul as an illustration may not be the best one, because this is a guy who's been through so many persecutions and beatings and been in prison. And here's a guy that probably really does, in a way, want to die to see his Father. But yet we all desire that one day when we die, we will actually get to see God. Have you ever thought about that moment? Like when you'll get to see God face to face, and see Jesus, and see the nail prints in his hands, and see Gideon, and see Esther, and all these wonderful characters of the Bible. As I grow older, I'm looking forward to that. But at the same time, I have a purpose here. I was listening to a preacher this past week that I listen to weekly. I just love him. He's a Bible preacher out in the Midwest, and I love listening to him every week. And he gave an illustration this week that I won't soon forget. He said that in heaven, we will not have the same opportunities to serve God like we do now. And the 2 things he mentioned is, he said that we will not, first, we will not have the opportunities to help people in need. And that could be a lot of things. That could be people that need physical help in fiscal areas, or with just need someone to come be there for them, or provide food or clothing or whatever it is. We won't have that. We won't do that in heaven. Or the brokenhearted. He mentioned the brokenhearted. We won't be there for those that just need someone to come up and just love on them and just show them love. We won't do that in heaven. So while we look forward to seeing our holy God in heaven, we should relish the opportunity that we have here on earth to do the things that he's intended for us to do. There are certain things that we will not be able to do in heaven that we can do here. So I needed to hear that. It just reminds me of why I'm here. And what's so tragic is that the devil has been more successful than I want to admit on convincing even Christians, people that call themselves children of God, that their life here doesn't matter. And we've seen even Christians take their own lives. And the devil's been successful in convincing them that their life doesn't matter. And our lives do matter. We are here for a reason. I am here for an intended purpose. And it's my mandate to fulfill that out and to live it out. Then verses 2 and 4. Solomon says, "It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting." Let me read up to verse 4. "For that it is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. Sorrow is better than laughter. For by the sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth," or pleasure. All 3 of these verses are saying the same thing, but in different ways. First, in verse 2, he kind of focuses over, I guess you could say, a funeral. It doesn't say funeral, but you kind of get that's the impression he's referring to. He mentions house of mourning as opposed to a house of feast. So in that culture, you kind of get the idea that maybe he's comparing weddings to funerals. And Tommy will tell you, I would rather go to a funeral any day than a wedding. I'm just not a big fan of weddings. But nonetheless, one of the things that is true about funerals as opposed to weddings, now, we compare the two. weddings are usually celebrating the beginning of something, whereas a funeral is mourning the ending of something. But both of them have a minister. Most of the time, these days maybe not as much, but in the past both of them have had a minister. Both of them are giving counsel. We see, at our church, if you're going to be married, you're giving counsel about your wedding, and then when there's also counseling when you're dealing with death, there's grief counseling. But Solomon is stating that it is better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. Now remember, Solomon is searching here. So he's focusing more on the negative. And I agree with this statement to a point. He says, sorrow is better than laughter. Yeah, that's debatable, whether sorrow is better than laughter. I mean, even Solomon himself in Proverbs 17 said, laughter makes for a merry heart. So, he kind of contradicted himself. I don't know that I agree that sorrow is better than laughter. But I would agree with what he said after that, the premise of what he is saying. And that is that we gain more from sorrow than we do from laughter.
And that's the qualifier at the beginning of that.
Right,
There's a colon
it
there.
is.
So it's not a period. He's not just making a blanket statement.
He's not.
It's better than laughter. He's then qualifying it with the statement after.
Yeah, he is. But I'm just saying that we can agree that sorrow is not better than laughter. If I have a preference over one, I'm going to prefer laughter over sorrow. But let's just be honest. What do we learn more from? For instance, one thing about laughter that hit me this week is that laughter is temporary. If I laugh about something, I laugh and then it's over. Like, oh, that was funny. And then you move on. But mourning is usually more permanent. If I'm mourning about something, then the result of mourning is something that resonates with me.
It almost makes you think more deeply.
It does.
Even about yourself or, like your life and your spiritual life. As well as, oh my goodness, look what happened to that person, I need to get help there, it's that just all different kinds of things.
Yeah. And so if I laugh, it's just quick. But if I mourn, I don't never just cry and then it's over. It tends to last and it resonates with me. And I think the other thought that is true about this is that he says, the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth or pleasure. The other thing that came to me is that a lot of times mourning comes from regret. Sometimes the mourning comes from regret from things someone else did. Sometimes it comes from the things we did. Have you ever mourned over something you did that was stupid? And so if you want to contrast what value we get out of laughter as opposed to what value we get out of mourning, if it comes from regret, then regret is something we learn from. And we can learn from someone else. If Kayla does something really bad and I mourn over her bad decision, then what I can do is learn from her bad decision. I can say, well, what Kayla did, I don't want to do. We don't learn that from laughter. Laughter is just a temporary, ha ha ha, made me feel good for a second. It's like the soap bubble analogy. It looks pretty for a second and then pop, it's gone. But mourning teaches me and I get value from it. So in some ways, what Solomon is saying is sorrow is better than laughter because we get more value from it. I've never actually gotten much advice or much good direction to life from comedy. I mean, it helps me enjoy my life for a little bit, takes me away from life, but it doesn't really give me good counsel on how to live it. And that comes from mirth or pleasure. Then verse 8, Solomon says, better is the end of a thing. This is an interesting verse. This is one of these verses this week when I was reading it. It's not part of our text, but I'm like, I got to talk about this. I was just reading this chapter and this verse jumped out. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof. And the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. What do you think that front end of that verse is saying where it says, better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof? What do you think that's saying in your mind? Because I have my own notes I wrote about it. But what is it saying to you? Because what I'm getting ready to say, it may not say the same thing to you.
Maybe when you've accomplished the purpose of whatever you were doing, is better than when you started a project. Darren was building something in the yard, doing something to the house, and to begin with, what is interesting or exciting could be, but when he's finished and you get to see it, then that's better.
In the
Okay, I like
Hebrew,
that.
the word end means reward.
Then that plays on what you're saying too, Susan. Yeah. Anything else that you think that that's saying? Because I want to give you my thoughts, but I wanted to hear what you had to say on this. Because what you get and what I'm getting, because of where I am in my life, this verse spoke different to me. Any other thoughts on that?
But again, it's hard for me to separate the two statements. I know we're trying to just focus on that first part.
I do want to.
But it's a qualifier, again. They're related.
Yeah.
It's not meant.
You always take my fun from me, Shelley.
Sorry. It's the English teacher. I'm sorry.
That's what English teachers do.
We break apart the language. We love it.
All right, so let me read the verse again. Shelley, oh my goodness. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. And you're right, that bottom half of that verse is really important. So I'll try to tie that into the end. But let me just say where I personally am spiritually right now and how that first part of that first statement really jumped out to me. And I know I've talked about this a lot, but I am thinking a lot about my retirement just because it's more defined in as far as a date now. I actually have a date. And time to me just 10 years ago was so different than what time is to me right now. Time before it was just, I didn't think about it having an ending. It just was vague as far as when it ends. But now to me, time, it actually has, I can almost see, I don't know when it ends, but I sense that it could be a certain time. For instance, I look at my retirement and I know that it has to last me this many years. And so I'm basing that amount of time based on my family history, the people that I know that are my parents and grandparents and how long they've lived. And then I'm just looking at the aggregate of what most people live, and I figure, that I have 30 years, 25 to 30 years is what I'm guessing. It's hard to imagine that when I say in 20 years from now I'll be 75. That to hear that just really just adds perspective to things.
It's even worse when you get there.
Well, I wouldn't have known you were there, so
I'm not, but,
okay.
A lot closer than you are.
Right, yeah, right. I got you.
You said you were talking about 10 years ago as to now. Well,
Yeah.
we're 10 years farther
You're in
along,
that,
so,
yeah.
it gets more real the further you go.
I just hope I make it 10 more.
But I guess so. When I read this verse, and Shelley, I'll try to get to the back side of it, but let me just stay to the front part of it first. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof. That is what jumped out to me. And as I am preparing for the end of my life, which I believe, based on just the average number of years that I've lived and what I think I'll live, I'm beginning to enter the fourth quarter of my life.
No.
And I mean, just based on averages, I think I am. I don't know. But I want to think that way simply because then it allows me to say, okay, I've got to make this fourth quarter. You ever watch these football games, and at the beginning of the fourth quarter, they hold up the four. And they're saying we got to end it well. What happens here is so important in these last 15 minutes. Isn't it 15 minutes of a quarter? I think it is. And so I want my life to end well. The end is in a way so much more important than the beginning. And I don't know what your mindset is, but I don't want to just be thinking about the trips I want to take or what I want to do around my property, but I want my life to be more spiritually focused. What am I going to accomplish for God in these last 25 to 30 years of my life? What will I be doing that actually makes a difference, not just for me, not the legacy, not for my kids, not what I leave behind. What can I do for the kingdom of God? And I want that to be my mindset. And that's what, when I read this verse, better is the end of a thing than the beginning. I want to end well, spiritually. That is my mindset. Yesterday, Tommy and I walked into Tractor Supply, and I don't know if she noticed or not, but there was an old couple there at the register. and they were old. And the guy, the husband especially, was really old. And he could tell barely, he does the old man shuffle. And, you could just see his face was drawn in. And I'm not trying to be crude, but the man, got not long. He's old.
He really is.
But
84, wasn't it?
But I mean, Pops, if you'd have saw him, you'd know he's, And so anyway, they were asking a price to the lady at the register, and the price was $4.99, and the lady just was like, "Oh, she was like, that's a lot." I'm thinking to myself, $4.99. I don't know what you're buying, but $4.99. It shouldn't be much. And I'm thinking, at that stage of my life, am I going to be that worried about? That's 75 cents more than I want to pay.
Yes, you will.
Yeah,
But
Kevin,
He's that way.
everybody here will say yes.
I know,
Just own it, brother.
I do own it,
He's
but
that way today.
I know.
hey, I'm not denigrating that. I'm actually going somewhere with this, positive.
Are you?
Yeah, I really am.
I think I have noticed and understand some of that in that when you go to buy something, when you can remember, well, not when you were 5 years old, but when you were young married, how much things cost, and now they cost just so much more. It makes you really think, well, do I want to pay this much? I remember my mom and dad, talking about, well, a loaf of bread costs, so-and-so, and this, that, and the other, and, I can probably remember 39, 59, I don't know, but now, it approaches $3 sometimes, and you think, wow.
Well, so, I mean, in my mind, and I don't really want to focus on the actual price. What I was thinking there is that I wonder at the end of my life how I will be with my money. Like, for instance, if there's an opportunity to do something spiritually, to give to a cause, will I be so tight because I'm on a fixed income that I won't be able to sacrificially give? You understand what I'm saying? I'm using that as a weird example. But in my mind now, I'm thinking spiritually as opposed to what that couple was thinking of was secular. I'm just wondering, will I still be as concerned about making a difference for the kingdom and giving when I know there's something I could give to? And even though I don't know how much longer I'm going to live and how much money I got left, will I still sacrificially give and not worry about what I have left?
You will.
And I hope I do. And I want that to be in my mindset as I get closer to that age that couple was in. So I'm not picking on them. I'm using the example that it's funny because God does that. That little weird thing was like God speaking to me as I walked through Tractor Supply yesterday with that. And then verse 10, I know I'm kind of bouncing around, but I'm just picking out verses that God spoke to me with this week. Verse 10, he says, say not you, what is the cause of the former days were better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Somebody else read that in your Bible. I know that mine sounded a little antiquated there. Read it. Joel, can you read that? And do you have the same as what version you're in?
I can.
Okay. Somebody that doesn't.
Do not say, why were the old days better than these? For it was not wise to ask such questions.
Yeah, so have any of you, I don't know if you guys, I was trying to think of yesterday, I was like, I wonder if anybody in here has seen Napoleon Dynamite. Have any of you ever seen that movie? Napoleon Dynamite?
Regretfully so.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you ever seen it, Mike? Have you ever seen it? Napoleon Dynamite? No? Okay. Well, have you seen it, Joel? Okay. So it's an odd movie. It's an odd movie, but it's clean. It has no cuss words, and but it's really weird.
If they shoot a cow in front of a school, that's little kids.
Okay. But it is clean, though, would you not admit? And it's hard to find clean movies today. And it's funny in an odd, queer kind of way.
Andrew loves it, we'll leave it there.
Andrew loves it, yeah. Well, but there's a character in that movie named Uncle Rico, and Uncle Rico is living in the 80s. He is living in the 80s. And what's weird is I don't know what it is about the 80s, but and so I don't know how you view the 80s, Pop, but for my generation, the 80s were good. I was we thought everything was better in the 80s. The music was better, and see, but we did. That was when I was in my teens. Ronald Reagan, there you go. Thanks, Joel. First president I ever voted for. So there was a lot of good things in the 80s, for us. And so what Solomon is saying here is don't romanticize. Don't look back at the good old days and say the good old days were better. Because what he's essentially saying is that everybody's always said that. People in his day said that. People in his father said that. And they've said it all the way back to Genesis. That, man, I remember the good old days.
So when my radio comes on in my car, it comes on a doo-wop.
The good old days.
The good old days.
But what Solomon is saying is don't live in the past. Live in the present. And eventually at some point we will look back to these days and say they were the good old days. Then verse...
I made a mistake one time of telling an old man I missed the good old days. And he said, good old days? He said, in my good old days, I grew up in the Depression. We didn't hardly have anything to eat. We didn't have inside toilet, no air conditioning. He said, those weren't good old days. So I felt, about that dig. I mean, he let me have it.
When I think the concept of living life forward is a phrase that we've talked about in our family at times, that just not constantly dwelling on looking backwards. Let's look forward. We have an eternity with Christ ahead of us as believers in Christ. So what's our journey going to look like from today till then?
Yeah, well said. Well, then verse 11. Solomon says, wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there is profit to them that see the sun. So it's interesting that he mentions an inheritance, because wealth acquired from an inheritance is not earned. And there's this term that I think the old movie Titanic said called a new money, where you inherit, and you get the money through you inherit it, you acquire it from ways that you didn't earn it. And but to be sure, he says that wisdom is good with an inheritance, and by it there's profit. So what he's essentially saying is that the inheritance is good too. There's profit with an inheritance, but he's saying that wisdom is every bit as advantageous or as good as an inheritance that you received. And he explains it further in verse 12. He says, for wisdom is a defense. How does yours say that? Is it a protection? Mm-hmm. Wisdom is a defense or protection, and money is a protection or defense. But the excellency of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to them that have it. So Solomon states that wisdom, just as money does, offers protection. Now we know money offers protection. You look at people that have a good amount of money and look at people that don't. People that don't have a lot of money tend to live in areas where there's more crime. They're used to police lights being in the area, sometimes even shootings, and that's usually low-income areas. Those are people that do not have a lot of money. And as you go up the pay scale and your median income, you see that these people live in nicer areas with less crime, to the point where you see very, very wealthy people live in gated communities and even have security walls and security gates into their residence and have all kinds of alarms and so on and so forth. So there is a truth that money provides defense or protection. But wisdom has an advantage, because wealth is susceptible to a lot of things that wisdom isn't. For instance, we live in the last 6 or 7 months, we've seen inflation go up almost 8%. Groceries are up almost 5%. Fuel prices are up. Everything's up. Everything's going up. So, for me, it's been a good lesson, because I'm watching, again, going back to my retirement, thinking about what I have and what I'm going to need. I'm thinking, well, that's something I got to keep in mind, because what looks like it'll sustain me for 30 or 35 years isn't going to work if inflation goes up at these kind of levels that we've seen in the last 6 months. And so wisdom is not determined by that. The economy, inflation, there's volatile things that affect my wealth, but wisdom is not affected by those things. Inflation can't take away the wisdom that God has given me. Then verse 13, he says, consider the work of God. For who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? Now, this is an intriguing verse. And when I got to studying it this week, my goodness, there is commentators are all over the meaning of what this verse means. And I'm just going to give you what I think it means, and you can kind of interpret it for yourself. It could be conjecture here as to what exactly this verse is saying. He's asking a question. You notice it ends with a question mark, but in a way it kind of appears that it's a rhetorical question, or maybe you could even say a statement. Let's read it again. Consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? Essentially, it's almost like Solomon is saying, observe the work of God. Observe what he's doing. And then he makes this statement, who can make straight that which he has made crooked? It's almost as if the context there of being crooked is whatever God does is inexplicable. It's not even maybe understandable. That God does things sometimes that are beyond what we as humans can fully understand. In other words, he says, who can make them straight? He that makes straight, which he has made crooked. In other words, maybe even defies logic. God does things sometimes that we as humans cannot really understand. And it's interesting that he would write that question right after he mentions wealth and wisdom. It's almost as if Solomon, and you may disagree with me, but this is the impression I get, that Solomon is saying that no amount of wealth or no amount of wisdom can help you really comprehend the ways of God. And you can't fix them. In other words, who can make straight God's crooked ways? Things that seem out of order, but they're God's ways. God has a way. We can't understand his ways. And probably a lot of it we won't understand until we get to heaven.
My commentary says God brings both prosperity and adversity into our lives for his sovereign purposes without revealing the key to his plan.
That's a good statement.
Which is kind of a summary of what you just said.
It is. And no amount of wealth or no amount of wisdom can change that. The sovereignty of God is the sovereignty of God. He has a divine order, and it will happen in his order. And no matter how smart Solomon was, or how rich Solomon was, or we think we are, we cannot change that. He expounds on that a little bit more in verse 14. He says, in the day of prosperity, be joyful, but in the day of adversity, consider. God also has set one over against the other to the end that man should find nothing after him. One of the things that hit me when I read this verse is why is it that God is always blamed for everything bad that happens, but never really is given credit for the good things that happen?
Or that comes out of that.
That's right.
Oh, good. That's actually.
Thanking him for what he
Yeah.
got out of that.
Amen to that. That's a good point. But aren't you glad though that God allows both? Because what if it was just always good? We never had any adversity in our life. How would we ever appreciate anything? What if it just never rained? It was just always beautiful. I mean, so the fact that we go through a week of rain and it's just nasty. We got rain coming up this week. After a while it gets old. But then when it's beautiful Saturday, hopefully, then we're like, oh, thank you, Lord.
I think I can handle that. Yeah, it's going to be just,
You think you're good?
yeah.
But we wouldn't appreciate it though. And
At a point, it was like that prior to sin.
It was. That's a good point.
It was perfect. That was God's intention for
Yeah,
us.
that is true. That is true. But I was thinking the other day, like somebody was talking about winning the lottery, and I was thinking, if I just had all the money in the world and I could just buy what I wanted to buy, I don't know that I would appreciate it like I have what I have now. Like now I've got a truck that's got 340,000 miles on it, and I appreciate it. It's just a good truck. But if I could just go buy anything I wanted, and money wasn't an object, I don't know that I would appreciate it. I kind of am thankful for what I have that I've worked hard for. And in a way, I also appreciate the things God has blessed me with. And sometimes the adversity is what helps me appreciate it. I go through mountains, but then I go through valleys, but then when I'm on the mountain, I look back and I see what I learned from it, and I'm grateful for what God allowed me to go through. And don't you agree that adversity can increase our dependency on God? And when I'm going through good times, I don't need God as much. But when I'm going through adversity, boy, I'm praying then. You know, it really draws me close to God. And then lastly, I want to end with verses 15 through 18. These are some really neat verses, 15 through 18. All things I have seen in the days of my vanity. There is a just man that perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongs his life in his wickedness. This is interesting, be not righteous over much, neither make yourself over wise. Why shouldest you destroy yourself? Be not over much wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest you die before your time? It is good that you shouldest take hold of this. Yea, also from this withdraw not your hand, for he that fears God shall come forth of them all. Those are some interesting verses. Now, I mentioned this in chapter 1 when we first started Ecclesiastes, and we don't know exactly when Solomon wrote this, what age he was at when he wrote it. But I think verse 15 gives us some indication, because he says, all things I have seen in the days of my vanity. And it gives us some indication that this is perhaps more towards the end of Solomon's life as he's older. In other words, he's seen a lot. He says, all things I have seen in the days of my vanity. So he's like you, Pops. He's seen a lot. Okay? But Solomon is noting something that we've all, I think, seen and maybe asked. He mentions here that there are people that, he mentions there is a just man that perishes in his righteousness. And then he mentions there is a wicked man that prolongs his life in his wickedness. And it bothers him. It bothers him that he's seen really, really good, godly men and women that died unjustly, died when they shouldn't have, and they were good people, and perhaps some bad thing happened to them out of the blue, and they were killed from just some crazy thing in life that just seemed to take their life short. And then on the other hand, he sees a person that just lives right on the edge, just spits in the face of God, just does everything that God says doesn't do, and yet he lives to a long, full life. I mean, smokes 3 packs a day, you know, and he's 88 years old and still drinking and smoking and cussing and just, you know, womanizing, and yet he's living.
The righteous man gets COVID and dies, and this guy doesn't get it.
Exactly. And in some ways, it almost conflicts with Scripture. Deuteronomy 5:33 says, you shall walk in all the ways of the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land in which you possess. So in other words, the Bible was saying that if we do what's right, it will prolong our days. And Solomon's like, well, why is it then that the wicked man lives and the just man doesn't? And it's further complicated by what he says in verse 16. He says, be not righteous over much, neither make yourself over wise. And then he says, why should you destroy yourself? It's almost like he's saying that, you know, you don't want to be too wise. And then verse 17, he says, be not over much wicked, neither be foolish. So he's giving 2 different type of counsels here. He's saying don't be too wise, don't be too righteous, but also don't be too wicked. So let me.
Used to say moderation in all things.
Right.
He is talking about balance, but let me invert this here, and let me go to verse 17 and talk about the wicked first. We might ask, why would someone live overly foolish or wicked, as he states it? Well, you remember when Tom mentioned this last Sunday and the week before about, you know, the under the sun, under the heaven type of reference. And if somebody believes that there's not a God and their whole life is everything about under the sun, well, that's the way they're going to live. They think everything is about the here and now. It's about an eat, drink, and be merry kind of way. So if you don't acknowledge your maker, and there even is a God, then this is your life. And your mindset is make it matter. It's all about now. But then if you do acknowledge that there is a God, what about the counsel that he says in verse 16? Don't be overly righteous or wise. That just seems like odd counsel. But I thought the teacher's lesson gave a good example, an illustration in my book that I thought was really cool. And it mentioned about a child that sees another child rewarded for a deed they done. And this other child observes this child having done something, and they get rewarded. So that other child thinks, well, I want to be rewarded. So he does the same thing with the hopes that he's going to get the same benefit or same reward as the other child. And what the lesson was saying is that the second child didn't do the good deed out of love like the first child did. The first child did it because he was genuinely concerned or did it for the right reason. The second child did it because he just wanted the reward. And the Old Testament in the Old Testament, we see that, and like I read in Deuteronomy, that a long life is paired with living righteous. If you want to live long, then live righteous. And it is possible, and I think Solomon is somewhat making reference to this, that a lot of people live their lives then and today with the idea that if I do right, I can live longer. And if I do right, I'll get to heaven. And it's very possible, and Jesus alluded to this in Matthew, that people can even avoid Jesus Christ as their personal Savior by just keeping all the moral laws.
About what?
By just keeping the moral law. And think about that. Jesus said it himself. He said, I will say to them in that day, I never knew you. And think about the people that he was talking to. The people that had cast out demons. This is preachers. People that had given tithes. People that had attended church. That were doing right, living righteously. But what he's saying is that you can live too overly righteous. In other words, it's the motive behind it. What is the intention? Are you trying to live righteous just so you can get? Or are you trying to live righteous because it's about relationship? And there is truth. It's scary to think. If it doesn't scare you, it ought to. Or maybe scare is not the right word, but if it doesn't impact you to think that you could live a moral, righteous life without Jesus and think you're going to heaven, that's a very impactful statement. And how many people do we know today that call themselves Christians that think they're going to heaven and they're following all the rules, they're doing this, they're living the life you're living. They're in church this morning too, but they have no relationship with Jesus Christ. Because it's not about ritual, it's about relationship. So when Solomon is talking about not living overly righteous, that's what he's referring to. It's a relationship with our God, our Maker, that's most important. And I think it's easy for us to get caught up. Let's just be honest, it is easy to get caught up in ritual.
And Kevin, I think it totally aligns what you're saying with this word study, because I think that word righteous, we kind of tend to think just that term is a term only referring to God and how God can make us righteous in his image. But the word study of that word righteous is lawful in the Hebrew. Following the law. It goes back to, are you following the law?
Right.
And then when it gets down to why should you destroy yourself? That word destroy means to make numb. So that whole idea of ritualism, you're doing all the things the law says, but you're being numbed from your relationship to God and the motive behind why we do things.
And I grew up, Susan, in a very strict environment. And it seemed like as I grew up and even in my teenage years, it was more about what you can't do than what you could do. And as I reached a certain point in my 20s, I began to question all of that. It just seemed like it was laws. And eventually I had to come to a point, why am I obeying these laws? It's not an issue of obeying, it's an issue of love. It is an issue of fear, but it's because it's not that I fear my father, I respect my father. And I don't want to hurt my father. And I feel like a lot of the way I grew up, and I've seen some of my own siblings reject this because they didn't have relationship with God. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't either. And I'll be honest to tell you this too. I'm just being honest. I struggle sometimes, just like in my tithing. I feel like at times I don't give out of a cheerful heart. I give out of ritual. I know I'm sorry to say that. I'm being transparent in front of you. I struggle with this at times. I feel like I have to give because that's what I'm mandated to do and I'm obeying the law. Are you with me? Have you ever felt that way? Please help bail me out, because I feel like at times I want to give because I love my Father, not because it's what I was raised to do and I'm supposed to give my 10% plus my offering. And I struggle with that. I think all of us as Christians do. And there is a point where we can be too overly righteous. And I'm glad you tied that lawful. We want to obey it because it's the law. And that's what...
My notes here, it says doing it in your own eyes by your own religious acts. So that's the same thing.
And that's where Solomon is here. It spoke to me this week, this chapter did. It was a wake-up call to me. Why am I a Christian? Why do I not cuss? Why do I not do all the things that I don't do? Why? Why do you not do them? And it really spoke to me. This is an incredible chapter. And that's what God spoke to me through this week. And I know I didn't stay anywhere to where our lesson was, but when I...
It reminds me of the Sadducees and Pharisees too, to the point where they were numb to the Messiah.
Yes, they were.
The life-giving Christ, because they were so caught up in the law.
That's why The Chosen is so awesome, where you see Nicodemus. He didn't, though. He saw something the other Pharisees didn't see. And that's where I want to be. I want to be in relationship, not ritual.
Think how blessed we are to be on this side of the cross. Because before Jesus Christ, all you did is you had the law. And the Sadducees and Pharisees, honestly, were living it to an epitome. But once Jesus Christ came in the human flesh, we all today can relate to him as a human being, especially on The Chosen. That's a great example. But he was human. He loved, and we can process that in relating to another human being. So it's so much easier for us on this side of the cross to have that relationship with Jesus Christ. I thank God all the time that I'm on this side of the cross.
Do you just out of curiosity, you can admit it, do you get emotional when you watch The Chosen on certain scenes?
I have.
It gets me. I mean, it's hard not to. Rick and I, we watch it on Fridays. We're both crying as we watch it. So I know it sounds sappy, but man, it's just neat to see it. Those moments, especially with Nicodemus, where he realizes who Jesus is. And that still can happen today. People can realize who Jesus is. Yeah, they've heard him all their life, especially growing up in Alabama. But when you come to realize who he is, he's a person. It's a relationship. And when you get to that place in your spiritual walk, I think you are at a different level. And you see people, have you ever looked at people that you want to emulate, and you see them and they just seem like they're on a different level? It's because I think they have gotten that. They are in a relationship with their God. They're not in ritual. They're not observing laws. They are trying to please their Father. And that's where I want to be, especially in this last quarter of my life. Any other thoughts?
Well, I thought what I got from what is better, are all things that he lists here that we would not necessarily think are better. A good name. How many times do you hear people say, well, I don't care what people think of me? How many times? And that's usually the 9 times out of 10. That's what most people will say. The day of one's death. Who thinks of that? They're thinking about life now. Live for today. Eat and drink for tomorrow we die. And then you got sorrow. Puts everything in perspective. People think about having a good time all the time. You wouldn't think sorrow would be the better thing out of the two. To hear the rebuke of the wise rather than listen to the song of fools. Really? Is here to hear the Bible read, or would you rather listen to the songs of those who hate God and don't acknowledge God and are leading people astray through their music? So it's easier when you compare it with today's conventional wisdom of the culture. These things that are better, you would not think they're not viewed as by people, the majority of people today, as being better than what they're doing. It's like, wow, talk about a contrast.
Yeah.
Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Not the type of people you think would be blessed. God's backwards, realistic way of looking at the way things really are.
Good chapter, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a lot of meat in this chapter. Well, glad to be back. Thanks for y'all being here. Hope you have a great week. Is the tropical storm bringing rain to us this week?
Supposed to.
Okay. Well, my garden will be happy. Means more good red tomatoes.
Yes.
I love you guys. I hope you all have a great week, and we will see you all back here next Sunday. Thank you again, Tom, for filling in for me. Really appreciate you. See y'all on Zoom.
Good Sunday school lesson.
We don't judge me if I have